this computer. Okay.
Yeah.
You can go. Yeah.
All right. So test run of the Marc and Mike Show. I'm Mark DeLucchi. He's Michael Lee. We're going to talk about some things. We'll run through. This is a draft, so not too big a deal. I don't know. I mean, I think definitely want to sort of start with we've been doing this for, close to 15 years.
It's only been recorded for like a few days out of those 15 years, but
exactly. So we've because we started basically in 6th grade, so that means this is year 11, 6th or 7th grade. So we're talking 11 years of this. We recorded it in 8th grade, and now we're bored, so we're recording it again. I feel like
it's just something to do. It's like even though sports aren't really going on, there's still a lot to talk about, and we're not even going to totally talk about sports this time. So there's it's just something to do, something to take your mind off of what's going on in the world, but yet still be engaged at the same time. So
I mean, because the thing is, right, like what is so wild is like everything is impacted. Like there is nothing that is immune to this. Like every facet of your life is impacted, right? Like your family, your job, sports, your hobbies, like television, movie show productions, right? Like everything is different right now, and going to be forever in some slight way. Obviously we hope and we expect of one day for it not to be to this level, but they're really sports for a lot of people is the escape. I don't think sports isn't the only thing that does that, right? But for a lot of people it is the distraction, and it's ironically this is the one story where sports is kind of what sparked it in the US, because I think a lot of people were still in denial about the impact it was going to have domestically. And then Rudy Gobert, I mean, you and I were both watching it, differently, Rudy Gobert tests positive. The NBA shuts down the seasons. That's surreal. We're watching that game on ESPN. But everyone's like, this game doesn't really matter. And
personally for me, when I was watching
the next few days.
Yeah, personally for me, when I was watching that, it was like when that was all unfolding, like before that, I was like, there's no way they're going to shut down the NBA or the NCAA. I thought for sure we would see, I think we had already found out earlier that day that March Madness was going to be behind closed doors, at least at the time. And then, stuff like that. I thought we'd be playing behind closed doors. I didn't think that the sports would actually stop. But then when Gobert got it, you kind of just realize, these athletes are humans too. It's like as much as we kind of forget that at times. And that was really what kind of turned around for me. And I was like, damn, this is like really serious. And that, life's not going to be the same. And it's like, pretty much for me too, it was like, I think on Monday, I come back for spring break that Monday. I don't remember what day that was exactly. And then there was discussions about, how school is going to go from there on out. There UCSD, I go to University of San Diego, UCSD had shut down to online classes on that Monday. And then you're like, well, are we headed in that direction? And it was a little bit of a strange time. And then all of a sudden, that happened on Wednesday. And I think it became pretty clear to me that that there is no way that school would continue. And after seeing that Gobert stuff, and it was like, I thought it was only a matter of time before school was canceled. And sure enough, the next day we get an email from the president saying that, schools, you all got to move out, school's canceled, all that. So it just kind of how quickly that happened. I mean, a lot of people aren't really talking about this, but I do think that the Gobert thing was a catalyst for a lot of what happened in America, at least.
Yeah, there's an article, I can't remember who it's by. If we do this tomorrow, I'll pull it up. But it's basically how Gobert is kind of like our idiot hero, because part of it was, right, there was because as everyone's like, oh, he has fever-like symptoms, we're running the test, and then that video clip comes out from a couple days before, right, where he's touching all the mics and being very nonchalant about it, which isn't just Gobert, right? Like we're seeing people in positions of authority who are still taking this approach to it. And so for sports fans, it was sort of a rare glimpse at one, we really aren't all immune, but also everyone everyone was kind of able to blame Gobert. And in the test since, who knows, Gobert could have got it from the Pistons, it wasn't him. But I think part of it was framed immediately as, look at what this idiot did. Like, look at what this dumb decision did. And so for all, fans, for other players, for everyone watching it, it became, well, I don't want to be like that. We're like, oh, if he can get it, and he was joking about it in this, like in the world of sports, it became very clear we are not going to take this casually in a way because of Gobert. Because I think if it had taken it further, if it had taken more time for a NBA, NFL, whatever athlete was playing, an MLB player to test positive, then it might have been a different reaction, because there is the element of like, we do idolize athletes. We do kind of separate them and say they don't deal with these problems or they're immune to it. And we want something else to watch. People do want a distraction right now, whether or not it's the right thing. And so him being kind of the first real major American celebrity that at least was in my realm or that I noticed. And I think for a lot of sports fans, that's what it was too.
Yeah, and I think even if you weren't a fan of sports, I think that was, I believe, the same night Tom Hanks got it and his wife.
It was.
So
yeah,
that
down
in Australia.
Yeah.
And I think one thing to highlight is like, I mean, maybe at first you kind of looked at Gobert as the idiot. You kind of blamed him for some of the things. But I think we've had more time to reflect on this, it's obvious that, like, as much as his behavior was pretty, like, kind of inexcusable, like with touching the mics and all that, it's like, I think in general, like, he was just kind of the one person, unluckily or so, that, kind of alerted us to the issue. Like,
no doubt.
That does not mean at any stretch of the imagination that he was the first one in the NBA. Like, there probably was somebody else in the NBA. I think even Doris Burke said today that, I mean, granted, she's not a player, but she interacts with them, and she was broadcasting the Mavs game, that last game of the NBA season, basically. And I think she said she thinks she had it, like the coronavirus, during the game she was broadcasting. So obviously she probably interacted with other people in the arena. It's like there's a lot of different ways where this could have spread. And, obviously the NBA, I think in American leagues at least, have had the most amount of cases. I mean, I'm pretty sure that's the case at least. But obviously it's like they were able to, they were the first one that shut down the season and basically made it impossible for any other sport to play after that. It's like, after what you saw there, it's like there's no way, unless you're Dana White, the UFC, that you could reasonably think that you could continue playing sports right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I completely agree with that, and that's sort of why the sentiment of the idiot hero with Gobert, I think, was kind of a good framing of it, in that Gobert really isn't to blame, right? Like, and him getting it, I think he very much had what I think made it him so valuable is that the mentality he had been approaching this with was the mentality most Americans at the time were approaching this with, which it's coronavirus. It's, right, we aren't far removed from, swine flu or the bird flu or SARS or whatever, but those outbreaks never reach this level domestically, right? In other places they did. So I do think there's also an element of that. Well, kind of an American exceptionalism almost that comes along with, like, we're going to be cool with this. It'll be okay. I have good health. I have health insurance I like. And then Gobert gets it. And then the NBA's reaction also, because I don't think the NBA had a choice, right? When Gobert tests positive, they had to shut it down. But if the NBA hadn't, like, part of it too was the NBA immediately says the season is over. When you watching it is like, okay, not only does a player have it, not only does a celebrity have it, and, a borderline all-star, in Gobert with a decent amount of celebrity, but then the league says one person having it shuts down $1 billion operation.
Yeah.
Right. Go ahead.
And I think for me personally, it's like one thing I noticed in the days after that is like, kind of watching that scene unfold. Like, I was watching ESPN that whole night. I was actually trying to do schoolwork at the same time. Couldn't focus. This was just so fascinating for all the wrong reasons. And I think watching that unfold personally, like, it made me myself realize the severity of it. Now, I noticed in the days after, because, like, this was a time when only the social distancing was only kind of starting. Obviously it became pretty clear what that should be, but it wasn't really preached well, or people weren't taking it super seriously yet. Like, I have so many friends that they still went to bars that weekend. They were still hanging out in large groups. While I was myself, like, maybe this is more just because I'm a risk-averse person rather than a sports fan, but I think watching that scene unfold with my own eyes, I mean, obviously I wasn't in Oklahoma City or I wasn't in Dallas, but just kind of watching that unfold personally made me realize right then, like damn, this is real, and we need to start taking this seriously. It's like, all of a sudden, like you start watching like CNN and like what Dr. Gupta's saying or what Dr. Fauci's saying in those press conferences. It's like damn, we actually need to like take this seriously. And I wish that some of my friends came to that conclusion earlier, because I'm afraid that like like they were spreading it by just hanging out with their other friends. It's like people were thinking, oh well, this should just mean like I don't do like this and that. And it's like, some of the same people that were advocating for online classes were also going to a bar that weekend. And it's, just the hypocrisy in that is honestly kind of crazy. But like, to me, it's just like that. I mean, I'm not really blaming them. It's like, I get it. It's like, a lot of people have a hard time grasping reality. And, that's, it's hard because, our generation has never really dealt with any of that kind of type of adversity. Like, I mean, really, our world hasn't really seen anything like this. And maybe the only thing you kind of compare this to is, well, obviously the direct comparison is the Spanish flu, but nobody's really alive from that. Or maybe World War II, because of how that really changed society. But like, I think for me, it was just like watching all that unfold just made me realize quicker how serious the situation was. And you almost wish that everybody could experience that, because I think if that happened, then they might have been quicker to realize maybe I should stop doing this and that and whatnot.
And that's where, again, like it's rare, if we keep doing this podcast, people will come very well aware of my thoughts that sports tends to be behind the curve on these things, right? Like sporting leagues tend to be the last to react. It's one of my frustrations, because they are chasing that beautiful dollar every day. And like they very much are willing to let a lot of what I would argue morals and ethics go in pursuit of those goals. And this was, again, the weird, rare instance, because I think of Gobert and because of the circumstances around it, where sports in many ways was ahead of the curve. Was even, I mean, again, state and federal governments are not on the same page right now, but state governments, it seems, were at least some state governments were even more proactive than the federal government. But even the NBA itself was with the first few cities. The first cities put on like the 1,000-person cap on events like a couple days before the NBA shuts it down. Like, I think it's fair to say not everyone, most organizations in the United States, most organizations worldwide, especially, but most predominantly in Europe and in North America, have been slow to react to this. And this is one where, relatively speaking, the sports world, the NBA especially, was actually a bit ahead. Like, I mean, again, we weren't immune to this, right? Like that happens on a Tuesday, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Gobert incident. But regardless, the Thursday before, you and I both were at University of Hawaii's volleyball game against BYU with how many thousands of people, right? Like, as much as we may have been a bit ahead of other people, but like that was because of Gobert. That was because like we are connected with this one sort of situation, and we saw, again, the NBA shutting down. Like, if you are not a sports fan, if you are not someone really follows it that closely, right? Like during the Spanish flu, the Major League Baseball held the World Series. Like during the peak of the Spanish flu outbreak, Major League Baseball said, yeah, we're going to keep this going. They didn't even have no fans. They had it happen with fans, and who knows how many more people got sick and died because of it. So like, this is, it's not unprecedented for these things, which we'll get to the UFC at some point, like the UFC, to try to go on as if this isn't really a problem. But
yeah, it's like, again, kind of, as a sports fan, it's like sports is always that dependable thing during wars. Like it was a big deal during World War II. FDR said, baseball should go on for the morale of the country. Like there was so many like different Army, Navy, Air Force leagues during World War II that had big players.
Right, like baseball. There, and again, the purpose of this aside, right? Like, baseball in New York, the Mets Yankees, a few days after, in the weeks following 9/11, is like a very symbolic moment, and like for many people in that city was a very incredible healing moment. Again, I don't think that's a political statement. I mean, I don't think that's really an ideological statement, and like that's what these things mean. And now, by the way, when these things come back, they are going to mean a lot. Like, there's going to be a lot of value. Like, the next time there's a baseball game, a Major League Baseball game, a college baseball game, a college basketball game, like all of these high school sports, right? Like, the next time we get these things, there is going to be a great appreciation. but it's sad and tragic for so many reasons, obviously well beyond sports, right? Obviously well beyond, you and I having online classes and, having to, reschedule graduation plans.
Yeah.
Like it is so engrossing of everything. And I know I'm going to be repetitive with this, for however long we're doing this, but it is. I mean, again, they talk about World War II and total war, right? How like everyone felt it and everyone was rationing and everyone was connected, is like, that is very much what this is. And yet I feel like there's even less control. Like it's even more out of the hands of people. And even though it very much, again, that's the thing, right? It's like a natural disaster, right? Like you can't say the natural disaster is going to happen, but we can prepare, we can react, and we can do what we can to help as many people so the damage is as minimal as possible.
Also, a natural disaster, it's really happens over the course of a day or two, and then you have to kind of deal with the fallout of it, and it's normally centralized in one city or one region. So it's like it's not affecting the entire country and the entire world as this coronavirus is. And like with that, it's like obviously still, even then, it's like sports still plays a role in those natural disasters. It's like the whatever World Series that was when the earthquake hit, it's like they only paused for a little while and then all of a sudden they're back playing baseball. Even though it was a World Series between the A's and the Giants, and it was in the Bay Area, obviously.
The 89 earthquake in the Bay Area,
Yeah, and then obviously, like, in that area was, like, there was a lot of damage and whatnot, but they still went back playing baseball. It was a way for people in the Bay Area and people around the country, frankly, to, find an escape from that. But that outlet doesn't really exist right now. It really shouldn't at this point, and it sucks. Like, there's no way to say it. It's like, like, you shouldn't – I don't think you should feel bad that you miss sports. It's like, just sucks. This whole situation just sucks. It's like I don't think there's any other way to say it, honestly.
Yeah, and that's the thing when I hear people and, talking to people where there's sort of this tentative, and again, I'm not encouraging any of this, either reaction, but sort of it's like, we don't want to panic. And like, obviously, like panic, in and of itself is like a negative, like, panicking is overreacting, right? You don't want to overreact, you don't want to overreact or underreact, right? At the same time, like, I do think part of it is it's hard for us to conceptualize, like, how big this is.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, again, I'm not saying panic. I'm not saying, but also like, just like, again, like 10,000 people worldwide have died and more people are. And, even people who survive are going to have permanent lung damage, and, debt from hospital bills because of, various health care system structures. And like this is just an incredible tragedy in so many ways. And you can catch yourself feeling bad about something like sports or, something minor, and then making yourself feel guilty because you're like, well, at least I don't have this, at least this isn't happening to me. And I think, that level of awareness, like that, checking of sort of like being aware of what privileges do I have right now, where me and you are talking about sports and not talking on the phone about something much worse. Like that's important to keep, but also to allow yourself, also to allow us, sort of a communal exhale and to be like, this is just like, there's no way around it. Is like everyone is being, almost everyone is being negatively affected here. And again, that's not like postmodern saying everyone is suffering the same. That is not the case. But everyone is going through, a lot of people are being affected. And
I think in this situation, I mean, obviously it's like one thing I've been trying to look at the positive, obviously it's a very stressful, somewhat depressing time, to be around. It's like, it's hard to kind of conceptualize what you're going through because it feels like a bad dream. It feels like a movie. And it's like, I just try to keep telling myself that, like, well, I could be a lot worse. I could be a waiter at a restaurant and lost my job. Like I could have contracted the coronavirus and given it to my parents or my grandparents. It's very possible. I mean, that's still theoretically possible. It's like some of the leading people are saying we should all treat everybody like they have the virus at this point. That's just the reality situation. And I think there's a difference because, like, obviously it's like a lot of people are saying don't panic, but I think a lot of people think it's like you either don't worry about it or you panic about it.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be somewhere in between because like we should all be preparing for this situation. Like I don't really blame people that are going to buy food because it's like you don't know what's really happening. It's like, will we be able to go to the grocery store in 2 weeks? I don't know. Like that remains to be seen. It's like, like obviously, like I think it's hard for me. It was hard not to somewhat panic. It's like you can criticize me all you want for that. It's like I went to the store. You call me one of those hoarders. Like I went to buy a lot of canned goods and whatnot. But it's like it's obviously that human instinct that kicks in, and it's like we don't really know how to deal with this. There is no right answer on how to deal with this. I'd say there might be a wrong answer on how to deal with it, but there's really no right answer on how to deal with this. Like I was struggling deciding whether I should stay in San Diego or come back home to Hawaii. I didn't know what the best thing to do was because obviously, like, I didn't really want to get stuck in San Diego, but then I didn't want to be the one that brought it back here and, gave it to my parents and all that. I mean, I found a pretty good middle ground at the end, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a future episode. But, like, there's just a lot of things that people are going through. And, like, I don't think it's invalid for people to, miss sports, even though there are, quote-unquote, bigger issues out there. It's like, we're all suffering in some way, like some more than others. And it's just, like just trying to reconcile our situations now is what's been hard, basically.
Yeah, and also keeping an awareness of who, giving yourself to acknowledge what you are losing, but also using that to understand what others are losing and who does need help more than I do, right? Like,
yes.
Like, for like thinking about sports and thinking about, again, we'll get into the specifics of, the union agreements and players and ownership and who's paying for what. But right, the very specifics of like the immediate thing was stadium workers who rely on that income where that is how they make monthly payments, and they are not making six figures, right? They're making, $30,000, $50,000, maybe only 15 in part-time work. Like those people were the ones most adversely affected by this because they were the ones who had the least to lose. I mean, like for players, for owners, they're losing lots of money right now. There's no denying it. But in terms of the long-term impact, I think that's the real thing, right? Again, a lot of people, most people, if not everyone, is losing, and give yourself time to acknowledge that without losing perspective on trying to make sure we're not helping ourselves at the expense of something greater. Like, again, if you aren't sick and you don't think you have the virus, don't go to it's just like basic things, right? That people are breaking. It's wild. And
it's
that's
hard because
it takes over, right? Like we were planning on talking about this. We were planning on talking about sports or something related, but it's like everything right now is so interconnected with this because, it shows how connected we are, right? Like for better or worse, the world, like how countries are connected, economically through travel, but also how reliant we are on, companies and all these industries and various things, which, again, I think it's a tremendous time of uncertainty. It's also a tremendous time for creativity, like in a lot of ways, like, and again, this isn't, I've said this a few times to a couple friends, is like, this will not be a good thing that happens. This will be a bad thing and a tragic thing that happens, but there may be some good that comes out of it, and that won't outweigh the loss, but, and, whether.
But you gotta admit, it's hard to look at those positives right now. It's like, I mean, I'll share a little bit of my situation. Like, I'm obviously in a pretty good situation. I have a, good roof under my head. Like I have parents that can support me, all that. But it's like, I'm even worrying about, I have a job offer for after this. It's like, I don't know, what the future holds. Like, I thought I had my whole future planned, basically. But obviously, this just shows you that life throws you some pretty nasty curveballs and sliders sometimes. and you don't, like, it's how you adjust, I guess. It's like, it's hard to adjust right now because you just don't know. Like, I mean, this might not become a non-issue for me. Maybe I've been stressed about nothing. I have no idea. It's like, I'm not working in the partner offices of the people that are making these decisions about my future, basically. But I think one thing I heard, or my mom was telling me she had heard on the like NPR radio or something like that. I don't know. But like, she said that they were talking about how, obviously mental health is a big issue right now. The one thing you can do is you can only do what you can control. And that's easier said than done because you're kind of at the mercy of a lot of factors right now. You're at the mercy of your government, you're at the mercy of your job. You're at the mercy of
The landlord, if you can't make rent, right?
You're at the mercy of a lot of things. But I think if you're in a situation where, you're like me and you, and, we're pretty much comfortable for the most part, it's like you just kind of have to try to take a step back and try to just, control what you can control, because this can be overwhelming. Like, I kind of stopped watching the news because it's just been too much for me to handle personally. But not saying that that's how everybody's situation is, but it's just tough, man. Like, there's nothing more you can say.
And trying to be aware and also have leaving the door open, right? That just because you're not going outside doesn't mean you can't help. Like, being aware of, again, I have my frustrations with fundraisers when I think, certain companies should be able to pay their workers, but, like people who are very much at risk of losing their homes or at risk, whether they're in poverty or on the cusp of it because they've lost income, is like, again, it is so uncertain and unsettling in so many ways. And, I'm fumbling over my words. You know me, Mike. I don't do that very often. But.
Yeah, I think we all are. It's like normally we're people, we like to have answers to things, and we just don't at this point, and that's just the reality of our situation.
And I also think one thing too, and again, I'm struggling. Like, by no means do I have this. Like, am I not doing this too? It's just the way we live our lives. We live them day to day. We live them hour to hour, right? Like, we schedule our meetings and we have, all right, I got that assignment due that day. I have that meeting next week. Like, we live very much day to day. And this is not a crisis we can think about in day to day terms. This is one we probably maybe week to week, but honestly more month to month.
Yeah.
Like, again, Governor David Ige, right, declared already, you're locking down till April 30th. That
it's probably going to be longer than that. I highly doubt this situation is going to be done by April 30th.
I've done a similar thing where I'm not watching the news or not checking updates, but I'm allowing myself like once a day, or every few hours,
I basically, for me, it's like I check my Twitter feed in the morning, and I think I see mostly what I need to see for the day. And I may check it at night, and that's about it. Like, I haven't really watched, I was watching CNN early on. Yeah, I'm not doing that anymore because that can be a bit much, stuff like that. It's like I watch the local news here and there. If like the governor or the mayor is making some big proclamation, then maybe it's worth watching. But other than that, it's like I've been trying to remove myself as much as I can. It's impossible to totally remove yourself, but I've been trying to a little bit, and I think that's been helping me out a little bit. But yeah.
So it seems weird to transition, but it also seems like a weird place to end it. So why don't you give me the rundown, because you're obviously more familiar with the situation than I am. I'll react to it, and we'll see if my thoughts have any merit to it. Why don't you give me the rundown of what happened with Jon Jones over this past week? I mean, obviously, there's a long story with Jon Jones. I know that. But specifically, most recently, where we stand right now.
Yeah, so basically, Jon Jones, he's the current UFC light heavyweight champion. He has been the UFC light heavyweight champion some form or the other sporadically. Now we'll get into why the sporadic is a thing. For I think about 10 or 8 years or something like that. It's been honestly one of the most interesting runs in MMA history, and he's been one of the most polarizing athletes in MMA in its short history. And a lot of people consider him the greatest of all time. I think, as somebody that watches a lot of UFC and MMA, like, he's probably unequivocally the greatest talent of all time. Now, what's interesting about him is you can actually make a strong debate that he's the greatest of all time, but what makes that hard is all of his missteps, because you almost feel like even though he's accomplished possibly more than any other mixed martial artist, he's also probably could have accomplished way more because all his transgressions outside the octagon. So basically, short story short, yesterday, like early in the morning, he was pulled over by Albuquerque police. He lives in Albuquerque, New Mexico now. Also, just a side note, if you don't know who Jon Jones is, you might know his brothers, Chandler Jones, a Pro Bowl defensive end for the Arizona Cardinals, and he has another older brother, Arthur Jones, who I think he mainly played for the Colts and the Ravens. He was an O-lineman, I believe. So Jon Jones was pulled over because there was gunshots that were heard, and then they basically pulled him over, gave him a sobriety test. He was like twice the legal limit, and he basically was found. They found a gun in his car, and they also found an open bottle of, ironically, Jorge Masvidal's tequila in the back seat. Great combination there, and without proof of insurance. So basically, he was charged with aggravated DWI in New Mexico, and he was also charged with like no proof of insurance. He failed the sobriety test, and he had an open container in his back seat. And this is by no means the only thing that has gone wrong for Jon Jones. I'm gonna pull up a list right now of things he's done in the past because I want to make sure I get this right. Because
and
it's such a.
I do know off the top of my head. Again, if I remember correctly, there is other previous criminal history, but at the very least, I know we have a number of failed drug tests that led to suspensions and other things, just through the UFC. So not even to the level of legal prosecution or whatever, but substances have been a problem for Jones for some time.
So basically, a quick rundown of what happened. So I'm just going to give you, he won the UFC light heavyweight championship in March of 2011. He beat Shogun Rua. It was like, he became the youngest champion in UFC history. Like, I think he was only like 23 when he did it. And I don't know if anybody will ever break that mark. It's such an incredible feat to win a UFC title at that young of an age. It's basically unheard of. And then, so basically, I believe the story is the UFC gave him a Bentley not too long after, and then he crashed into a pole. And he was arrested for a DUI back then. He pleaded guilty. He only ended up paying $1,000 fine, and kind of had to do some like other DUI classes and stuff like that. He also the biggest incident, and this caused the UFC to actually strip his title back in the day, was in April of 2015. He was charged in a hit and run. He hit a pregnant lady. And fled the scene, obviously. And then his car was found deserted, and it contained like marijuana inside of it. It had like a ton of condoms, I think, and might even had cocaine. I'm not totally sure about that one. And then after that, he was stripped of the title. Eventually, he came back. He won an interim championship against Ovince St. Preux. This was at UFC. Let me get this right. I remember this fight. I just don't remember exactly what it was. It was UFC 197. He was supposed to face the undisputed champion, Daniel Cormier, who, if you follow the sport, one of the greatest rivalries of all time in MMA history. There's also, if you want to watch, there's a beef history video on YouTube by SB Nation. Shout out to them. Does a really good job kind of just like laying the story out there. And then basically he was supposed to fight Cormier at UFC 200 and failed a drug test from USADA. And I think he claimed it was like Turinabol, I believe. And it came from a penis enlargement pill, basically, I believe, is what happened. And then he came back, he beat Daniel Cormier. And then after he beat Cormier, another failed drug test. Although he's been trying to claim that and he actually kind of successfully claimed that failed drug test came from like a pulsing effect. So like where the steroid was still in your system and it kind of just stayed in there. It's quite
so one basically from one of the previous tests, it was still there, is what he was claiming.
Exactly. Now it was like it's called this picogram issue. It's complicated science. I don't really totally understand it. And honestly, from what I had read before, it's like sometimes scientists kind of question the validity of that claim. But regardless, he's had steroid issues basically. And I know he's also had cocaine issues. Like he was admitted to rehab. He didn't really stay very long, from what I know. And then he's come back.
Last year, right? There was, if I remember correctly, there was an incident, right, of assault and battery. He was charged.
There was a battery charge at a nightclub in Albuquerque. In the end, he pleaded no contest, and I think everything was basically waived after that in the legal system. And then obviously now we come to yesterday morning, the DWI charge and the weapons charge. So obviously that was a very long explanation. He's basically undefeated. His one loss came back in 2009 to Matt Hamill. MMA fans know it was reffed by Steve Mazzagatti, who's the absolute, I don't hesitate by saying this, the absolute worst referee in MMA history, made this horrible ruling. Really, that loss shouldn't be there. Like, he basically finished him. Like, that loss shouldn't be there. But regardless, he's 26-1. He just beat Dominic Reyes in what was, if there was ever a questionable fight in Jon Jones' career, it was that fight. He barely beat Dominic Reyes, and many of the media members. I haven't really watched that fight again, so I'm not gonna really comment on who I think won that fight. But many of the media members believe that Dominic Reyes should have won that fight. Just some bad judging, which is normal in MMA. But so basically, it's just, it's obviously just sad to see. It's like his risk management skills, I think, is pretty. Whether obviously he's innocent until proven guilty, but like with his track record, his risk management skills are pretty darn bad, I'd say. Like, well, you can't really skate around that.
Also, right, I mean, we're talking about someone who is a supreme talent, who sells well, but who is given, like, this is a perfect example. Again, we see this throughout sports. We see this throughout the world, right? He's really good at something and gets away with a lot, right? Like, and I think it's also sort of a good time to extend, because I do think these things are connected, right? We talked about American sports and sports around the world shutting things down, and the American sports leagues actually being one of the most proactive, the most ahead of the curve on that. The UFC is not. They are still, running these events, and I think they've moved locations. If I do remember correctly, did they have a crowd in Brazil, right?
They didn't. It was in front of no fans, but they still flew a lot of fighters to Brazil.
Fighters around, and I think Jon Jones is a symptom of a system that really isn't holding anyone responsible, right? Whether it's totally their fighters or the league themselves.
It's like another example to remember about that is there's actually a code of conduct for UFC fighters, but ever since Endeavor purchased the UFC for $4.2 billion, however many years ago that was, they've been more hesitant to actually discipline fighters. And the obvious example is Conor McGregor. When McGregor threw the dolly into the bus in Brooklyn, at the bus that contained a bunch of fighters, including Khabib Nurmagomedov and some other, even female fighters were in that bus. Other than what was happening through the legal system, which basically just gave him probation, he didn't get punished at all from the UFC because the UFC wanted his drawing power at the box office. Now, while Jon Jones isn't really a pay-per-view draw, like he's only ever drawn close to 1 million buys, I believe, when he fought Daniel Cormier the second time. I'm going to double check that here. He drew a little bit better earlier on in his career, but recently he hasn't been the big draw he once was. And we're also starting to see with Jon is that his skill level is kind of declining. He's only 30 something, but he's been fighting for so long that like he's kind of declining a little bit earlier than a lot of fighters would.
Do you think that makes it more likely that the UFC might react to this with a more strong punishment to try to sort of make up for to sort of get people off their back who are saying you haven't been holding this guy accountable, but also they can now do it without necessarily risking, one of their big celebrities, and maybe they can kind of get rid of someone who they're kind of tired of dealing with anyway?
I highly doubt that, because I think if you had a bigger star, maybe in light heavyweight division, they'd be willing to do it because the windfall wouldn't be as bad. But really, you're looking at, if you strip Jon Jones of the title and you suspend him for however long you decide to suspend him, then you're looking at a vacant title fight between probably Dominic Reyes and Jan Blachowicz, who I'm pretty sure you yourself, as somebody who doesn't really watch, have never heard of them before. So obviously that's not gonna draw very well. So you can look at the financial sense. Also, like, I think the only way that they strip him is if he gets jail time, and it's possible, because like New Mexico might look at him as a repeat offender, especially with the drink, like driving while drinking thing, which
the battery and that,
which to me, like, driving while drinking is pretty inexcusable. And they might look at it and say like, this guy has not learned his lesson. Now, I'm no legal expert, but like they might say like, this guy has not learned his lesson. Maybe we got to throw him in jail for 30 days. I don't know. Like,
and also, right, the battery charge, right, that was in Albuquerque too, right? So
yes.
So, like, again, that's not just, and obviously we have the hit and run incident. We have, two, what potentially could very well be 2 DUI incidents, but also, incidents where he's physically violent with someone, and that female waitress. It's just it is kind of a weird thing to talk about the UFC, because it does seem they kind of live in this in-between space that, say, like leagues like the NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball, even the NCAA, even the Olympics and FIFA don't, where they haven't ascended beyond a very large but niche following, right? And part of that is the nature of doing mostly pay-per-view, right? But Like someone like me who's pretty engaged with ESPN, pretty engaged with sports stuff, stumbles into an occasional UFC story, but isn't really invested in it, right? That's not going to be on the ESPN slate, or the sports radio slate. You kind of have to look for UFC stuff. There's a lot out there, but you got to look for it. And so what that kind of does is it allows them a level of flexibility to get away with not really punishing someone like Jones, right?
Yeah.
Again, there's no denying, or at least I guess there is denying, in my opinion, right? There's no denying that many of these sports leagues, especially the NFL, NBA, and Major League Baseball and college, are slow to react and often are unwilling to punish their players. What I think and what most people would say is a fair amount, whether we're talking about domestic violence, whether we're talking about DUIs, whether we're talking about, misconduct in general, especially off the field stuff. But the one thing I will not disagree with is that these leagues get a fair amount of criticism for it. Like the NFL has, again, I think most people would agree, not handled domestic violence well, not offered fair or just punishments, but that got talked about a lot and even continues to get talked about by mainstream news sources. Anyway, what's interesting for the UFC is they benefit because since they don't get a lot of coverage, they really only get covered when something really good happens, when there's a really popular fight, or something extremely wild happens, like when McGregor threw the dolly, right?
I think I would only push back on that point on a few things. I tend to agree with you for the most part. I think the UFC is – so it's kind of this weird struggle with the UFC. It's like they want to be mainstream, but they don't want to at the same time. Mm-hmm. It's like the UFC brass for the most part is kind of – with the actions that they've done over the last 5 years, let's say, it's given the appearance that they want to go mainstream. Like they've signed this deal with ESPN, which I think has helped them in the last year ever since it was begun in beginning of 2019, try to kick into those mainstream audiences a little bit more because, sports fans watch ESPN. It's more exposure overall than Fox gave them. I think obviously, to me personally, they will never become truly mainstream unless if they do things like unionize or, treat their fighters better and stuff like that.
I hope that would make the difference. I don't necessarily know. Well, I think it honestly has to do with changing the revenue stream where they don't need to do pay-per-view, right? I think part of this is pay-per-view, natural, like boxing, right? Like boxing is the most revenue, the best revenue gain sport for boxers, but will always be limited because the 5-year-old, a child is not going to become a boxing or UFC fan most likely unless their parent already is one. Where
to me, honestly, my thoughts on pay-per-view has always been I don't think they should be doing as many pay-per-view events as they should. I think they should only do pay-per-view for the big ones, like the McGregors versus the Habibs. And, anytime McGregor fights, that's fine. I think you'll get a good amount of coverage, but I think it would benefit them to build more stars and a brand if they showed more title fights on ESPN, on the regular platform. Somebody like a champion like Alex Volkanovski or even a Henry Cejudo or something like that. It's fans that fighters that mainstream, a lot of mainstream sports fans don't necessarily know too much about. But I think if you showed them on ESPN, that could help build their profile.
And there's also, right, how again, for people who aren't as familiar with sports, maybe are watching this because they're really bored and they're our friends, which we appreciate you if you are, the way media politics plays into this. ESPN, this is talked about a lot. NBC, they own the Olympics. That's their big thing. Mm-hmm. And when NBC had the Olympics and ran, I think it was not Sunday night basketball, but they had NBA basketball games. The Olympic basketball games were prime time on NBC aired. Then the NBC contract with the NBA came up and they didn't renew it. It went to ESPN, and TNT are now the major NBA national televisors. Well, now the basketball Olympics are not aired on primetime on NBC, right? They're now aired at worse time slots. There's also an element where if you give ESPN some good fights, which, again, they're sharing more, but ESPN is going to cover you more, is going to give you more time naturally, because now, again, this is a reality, right? That there's a weird thing with sports media that they have an investment in the sports leagues being successful because that's, there is a very symbiotic relationship. And so we're, taking things off pay-per-view, giving them to networks also means those networks are now invested in you more.
Well, what's also interesting about that is with the ESPN deal, what you saw is that now you can only buy pay-per-view on ESPN Plus. Before, you used to be able to buy with your cable provider, which is easier for most people. And you've seen a decrease in the amount of pay-per-view sales. And it's kind of interesting because even though ESPN they're probably making more money overall because of that move. It's like it might be stunting the growth of the UFC possibly. But then you also could say that, like, I've seen more coverage of the UFC in general since the beginning of 2019 than I've ever seen before. And that's a large part thanks to ESPN.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
ESPN's featuring all these fighters and they're doing all these interviews. And, you know, like, heck, even now, like, with no sports, like, I feel like every night on ESPN, too, you can find, like, old fights and stuff. Like, you never used to really see that before. So.
And again, especially, and I think, you know, if we ever talk about like WNBA or women's sports and sort of one of the issues, right, we see that sort of in how these leagues often aren't covered by ESPN and stuff because there is what's going on. Like there is, you know, sports popularity is partly tied to how these leagues market to fans, but it is also extremely impacted by how media portrays the leagues.
Yeah, and it's like, I'll just use the example of the UFC. 2 or 3 weeks ago, UFC 248, everybody wasn't talking about the main event between Israel Adesanya and Yoel Romero because it was a bad fight, honestly. But right under it was arguably definitely the greatest female fight. You can make an argument it was one of the greatest fights of all time between Weili Zhang and Joanna Jędrzejczyk. That got a lot of coverage. Like, a lot of celebrities were talking about it. ESPN was talking about it nonstop. Like, It was like the UFC brand has given exposure to female athletes. Now, they still don't pay their women's athletes as much as they do their male athletes, in the most part, unless your name is like Ronda Rousey or Amanda Nunes or something. But like, other than that, but the one thing they do have is the exposure platform that a lot of women's sports don't have. It's kind of like how with tennis, it's like we still care about like women's tennis because it's Wimbledon. You know, like Wimbledon champion is a Wimbledon champion, like in our eyes for the most part.
Yeah, and again, right, that fight doesn't get that coverage on ESPN if ESPN doesn't have that deal with the UFC, right? Like
highly unlikely. And it used to get a little bit of coverage, but it wouldn't get the magnitude of coverage that it gets now.
Yeah.
But I think going back to Jon Jones, it's interesting because also too what we've seen from Jon is that his talent isn't so far ahead of the competition as it once was, and he's still winning fights. Like, he's still basically undefeated. So it's hard to say this, but like, I don't think he can really reasonably live the lifestyle that he's been living, you know, in order to continue. And also the part of the problem is we don't really know what's going on in his life. He doesn't, you know, there might be something going on in his family that's causing him to do this all of a sudden. But also what I saw is, like, I watched this interview that they did before his last fight on ESPN by Ariel Helwani. And he asked Jon, he was like, you know, are you still drinking? Are you still partying? And he still is, you know, despite everything that's happened. And I'm not saying he shouldn't have a good time, but at the same time, it's like I think it's hard to comment because we don't know exactly what's going on. But
well, I don't think it's that bold to say there are a lot of signs and a lot of hints that Jon Jones has a substance abuse problem and has had one for an extended period of time. Yeah. And, you know, and he's also been in an environment where that behavior has been really unchecked. Like, yes, he tests positive, but it's, you know,
he's still winning fights. Like, he's still making pretty good money.
How we view like Jon Jones in the context of UFC to how we view Barry Bonds in the context of Major League Baseball, right? Like, in terms of the conversation, right? Bonds, in terms of numbers, is clearly the greatest player of all time. But if you try to say he's the greatest player of all time, someone's going to remind you of his positive, you know, actually he never tested positive, but let's say preponderance of evidence to suggest that he performance enhancing drugs. Which again, well, you know, that's a separate debate, but that's just there with Jones because of the culture of UFC, because of sort of the way we view these sports. That doesn't really come as a demerit for him, and he's been able to kind of go unchecked with this. And again, I think it's fair, right? You know, most people who are dealing with substance abuse, right? Like, there are reasons for it beyond just, you know, no one chooses, right? But I think Jones is someone we've seen a pattern of damaging and negative behavior for some time, and he's not someone necessarily who I'm going to give, or most people I think are going to give the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, I don't think most people aren't really, and I think all we can hope is that, you know, if this really is true that he has some problems, and all signs point to it for the most part, you hope he gets help for once, like, and you hope it's sustained help. Like, he's checked into rehab once, and then he checked out the next day. You know, it's like, that can't continue. It's like, he needs to get to a point where he can get sustained help, and I hope he does, because or else he's just going to continue to waste more talent. And even though he's accomplished more than what most have, you want to see his true potential.
Well, but I mean, I'm going to sort of push back against that because I think we can get caught, especially as fans, when we see an athlete that we are chasing their potential, it's like, even if it means he never fights again, like, I think, again, like we should want these
Yeah,
athletes to
no,
be happy and
yes.
healthy, right?
And
Like
I
if
think
that's
potential can mean a lot of things. It can mean his
okay,
personal
yeah,
life.
yeah,
It can mean his athletic life.
I agree.
It's like, I mean, I think he will fight again. Like, no matter what, whether he gets stripped or not, he will fight again. I think the scary part is that what we've seen from Jon is that, and I think I've heard a few other media members talk about this, is that, like without fighting, what has he become? Like fighting is the one thing that'll keep him some sort of structure. Will like give him a reason to train, obviously, and to stay somewhat disciplined. Even though, like, it's pretty incredible that like he talked about one of his toughest fights ever was against Alexander Gustafsson. It's going into the UFC Hall of Fame this summer. It's one of the greatest fights of all time. And this was back in, I gotta get this right, 2013, and he said he literally was doing cocaine the weekend before, and was barely training for this fight, and was still able to beat one of the top guys in the world, albeit in a closer fight. Like, if he was really training hard, he probably could have dominated this guy. But, like, kind of just shows you what kind of talent he has, but I don't think he can skate.
Well, to be fair, I mean, again, I think it's fair to point in there, though, he's taking a lot of performance-enhancing drugs. Like, that also,
Yeah.
like, and again, this is where I think we can't, again, it's my thing with Bonds is he is one of the greatest of all time. I think it's fair to say, though, the numbers, don't necessarily make part of the argument, but you also can't fully trust them, right? Because of, what we know he did.
And fighting is a hard sport to condone doping because you're literally hurting somebody, and you might, like, there's one example where, like, this one guy, there was a time when, before USADA came into place, that TRT, testosterone replacement therapy, was allowed, basically, for the most part, by athletic commissions, which led to some pretty crazy physiques. And there's one example where Dan Henderson at UFC 100, who was probably under TRT, like, I think that's a pretty safe assumption, knocked out I'm thinking a different fight. Vitor Belfort. Like, if you just want to go look at something funny on the internet, go look at his physique with TRT and look at his physique after TRT. It's pretty obvious he's taking something. But he knocked out Michael Bisping, who's always been known as this, like, he's a big trash talker. A lot of people don't like him. He's kind of an arrogant guy. But one thing you can never say about Michael Bisping is that he doped. You're almost pretty sure he's one of those guys that you're pretty sure he never doped in his entire life. Like, and I believe him when he says that. And he literally, Belfort knocked out Bisping and basically caused, like, his retina to detach. It's like fighting has serious consequences when you do dope. Like, if that means you have more power all of a sudden that can, in a sport that's like inherently about hurting people, you could really seriously damage somebody's career, their life, like anything. Like, so it was. Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, so with this in mind, with Jones, one, what do you think the UFC will do? But two, what do you think? And I think this is the more interesting one. What should they do, or should have done? Right, like.
I think they're just gonna. What they're gonna do is right now they're more focused about staging the Khabib Tony fight, so they're not gonna think about this for a little while. They're gonna let the legal process work out. And I think if Jones evades prison time, which honestly he probably will, these are technically still misdemeanors, right? Like, and
he'll have the legal team to help, I mean,
exactly.
Like,
he will have a good legal team to help him. That's for sure. Now, if that's the case, then I don't think he's gonna get stripped. Now, I think I don't think it's the worst idea to suspend him at this point. I think even though cage fighting is the one thing that keeps this guy sane, it's like, I think you need to take this away from him for a little bit, and you need to hope that you can somehow get him into a rehab center of some sorts. Now, will that happen? That's not going to happen. Like, I don't think that's going to happen. Unfortunately, like, that's not going to happen.
It's fair to say, I mean, we see it with how they're reacting to COVID-19. UFC doesn't really care about their fighters beyond what they can do for the UFC.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty established, I think. I mean, Dana will care for a few fighters that he personally likes, but if he doesn't like you, it's going to be difficult. Like, we saw that with Chris Cyborg with her contract negotiations, like, at the end of last year, and then she ended up jumping to Bellator. It's like we saw this back in the day with Tito Ortiz, although he's a questionable person in general, but like, he had issues with Dana White. So it's like pretty much if Dana don't like you, you're gonna have a problem. Like that's kind of just how it works. But I don't know if Dana really likes Jon Jones. I think he's willing to tolerate with him because like for the most part when he's fighting, he's a pretty reliable draw. He's not gonna do really bad, but he's not gonna do outstanding numbers. It's like Conor McGregor, it's harder to get him into a cage. Anytime you get Conor McGregor into the cage, you're going to get at least 1 million pay-per-view buys, which is great, absolutely great night of business for the UFC anytime that happens. But, and especially the fact that I heard recently that part of the reason why some people are theorizing that UFC is still trying to go on is because Endeavor, which is like a talent agency company who owns the UFC, is cash-strapped right now. And they see the UFC as a way they can make money right now. That's a theory. It's not proven, but it's a theory. And I tend to believe that, honestly. Like, it would kind of –
UFC is probably – UFC is the newest of any of these leagues we talk about, right? Like, it's relatively new. And so it wouldn't shock me if they aren't they aren't really in a position where they can afford to let too many checks go by, right?
See, I don't think – like, as a company, the UFC will survive. Like, that's not a problem. Like, I don't think – now, knowing the UFC, I don't think – like, if they decide to go off, they're not going to pay the fighters. Like, I'm pretty certain about that. Now, I have nothing to back me up on that except for just kind of how, in general, the UFC has acted over the years. Like, I don't really – like, that's part of the reason why I think they do want the fights to happen and the fighters are willing to sign on to that is because there's no union, first of all. So, and there's always been – like fighters don't even really want to unionize at times because they're afraid at what might happen. So it's like, that's kind of always been an issue. It hasn't really been addressed recently, but I think that could be something that's playing a role right now, obviously. And that fighters are rather just, fly somewhere and take the risk and fight, because they need the money. It's like, and the UFC, I think it's unlikely that they're actually going to give them the money.
Because Dana White is someone who has so much power, right? You don't want to be the one, right? Like if he says we're going to fight here and you turn that down.
Yeah, all of a sudden that's going to affect your future in general. Yeah. It's like you might not be able to get a title fight in the future. You might not be able to, it's a little bit, the UFC is different. And it's kind of like, UFC and boxing is different because like, unlike professional sports, like the NBA, the NFL, it's like, it's normally all about performance. You have a lot of other factors that precludes you from making money in the UFC. It's like, I use always the classic example is Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson, the former flyweight champion, who a lot of people haven't even heard of, even though he set the record for the most amount of consecutive title defenses. And nobody really liked him, though, because he wasn't the most exciting fighter. He wasn't knocking people out left and right. He was probably the most technically gifted fighter the sport has ever seen. But he didn't talk trash, which is obviously a big part of MMA. He wasn't entertaining in that sense. So he never really got a foothold in the UFC, and the UFC actually literally traded him to a promotion in Asia. So that just kind of shows you, it's like, I don't think the UFC is definitely not gonna, pay these fighters. Like, I don't see that happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But what I like with Jon, like going back to Jon, like this might be the last thing I say about it, but like, it's just that like, I think I might have mentioned it earlier, but it's like, his last few fights have been close. It's like, he's not the dominant force that he wants to be. So like, purely from an athletic standpoint, like we've already talked a little bit about the other things,
like sort of putting the personal stuff aside.
Yeah. Purely from an athletic standpoint, it's like, I don't know if he can keep living like this because he's going to lose one of these days. And that's kind of like his aura is built around invincibility, basically. Nobody's been able to solve this puzzle totally. I mean, Dominic Reyes kind of did last time, but he didn't end up getting the decision. Like he's still a good fighter. Like he's changed his style. He's a more aggressive fighter early on in his career. Now he's more defensive minded. He's really, even when he has a really good chin, so he's able to take a lot of shots. But like, that's going to catch up to you after a while. And you're not going to go like, nobody's in MMA. Like the only person I feel is going to retire undefeated is Khabib Nurmagomedov. Like it's a very hard sport with the uncertainty that's involved with it, with 4-ounce gloves and whatnot. To be undefeated, it's hard. You don't see Floyd Mayweather's in MMA for the most part.
Right. I mean, it's like the human body isn't made to play football, but the human body really isn't made for this, right?
It isn't.
These are not things that,
And that's what we love about the sport because it's so violent and it brings great entertainment value, like being honest. like it might show our barbaric side, but that's the reality situation.
That's the thing. I don't know. I mean, again, and I don't even mean to. This isn't like condescending because there's plenty of things I enjoy that are clearly negative and not good in other ways. But that's one of the things is I've never necessarily gotten into that side of it. Or I've never really gotten that invested in UFC or MMA. But I think, to be fair, part of it too is, right, like since I grew up, we didn't really have internet. We pretty much just had basic cable, right? So I also just wasn't exposed to this. Like I was exposed because we had ESPN Classic for a bit, like classic boxing fights.
Yeah.
So I got to see I watched Butterbean once, classic.
Butterbean.
But like,
Butterbean
so I
actually fought in MMA like at one point. Yeah, like some amateur MMA fight, but yeah.
On his opponent.
Yeah, literally.
But so I got kind of a connection to boxing, but I think also, and this is one thing that how sort of, I guess, to bring it to a general point before we wrap up this, maybe this will just be the thing, but or if it's a test or whatever, is for leagues, whether it's the UFC, whether it's the MLB or NBA or NFL, you want to constantly be bringing in younger people, but especially kids, because like that's going to be your fan base down the road, right? These are the people who are going to be invested, who are going to hopefully play your sport, if not play the sport, work in the sport, if not work in the sport, watch and pay money and invest in the sport. And, it's like, I remember when I was young, there'd be like, a gap, in the Olympics, right? They'd be like, why isn't there an Olympics now, right? And they'd be like, well, there was a World War, or there was this, or there was that. Like, that is what we're looking at very likely this year is going to be for many of these leagues. But unlike those years past, this is the first time in the modern construction of sports where players, rightfully so, and probably, again, I would still argue should be getting paid more, but players are getting revenues that they've just not seen. Like in the 1950s, 60s, players were getting $50,000 a year in major league.
Back then, most of the sports were amateurs. So
most of them were amateurs.
The structure's changed.
And even the ones that were pro, you were upper middle class, maybe borderline upper class. You were not paid to the level you are now. So TV revenue is obvious. TV as an entity, as a commodity, was not developed in the way it was with the sports enterprise. Like so much is tied. Again, it is every one of these leagues we're talking about is a billion-dollar industry, and probably more tens of billions of dollars industry. And so, like, one estimate came out: the NBA. Remember, they played a good portion of their season. And if they don't play the playoffs, if this is it, they're foregoing, by one estimate, $1 billion in revenue. Right? Like, that's how massive this is.
Yeah.
So these leagues are going to have to figure out, right? Like, how are we going to try to build our fan base through this? Like what creative things, again, like there is opportunity for creativity, innovation. If we see condensed schedules, maybe we see more double headers, maybe we see some, NBA starting on the in-season tournament. Maybe that ends up just being how they finish the season, a sort of a March Madness style thing is to replace that. Colleges, right? Think about college athletics, especially as this goes longer, if it does trickle into football and football revenue, which football props up a lot of mid-major and smaller athletics programs, that could put them at risk, and they're going to have to get innovative. Like, again, it's a time of such uncertainty everywhere, and in sports is really no different. And so it's going to be, that's why we're giving ourselves these platforms, because we're going to talk about it,
Yeah, so just to give you guys
while hopefully,
this is definitely better than twiddling our thumbs, that's for sure. But I think just to give you guys an overview of what we're going to talk about in the future, whatever our next episode is going to be, we kind of went longer on this test episode than we thought we would. But honestly, like, it's been a pretty good content, so we'll probably just end up posting it anyway. Next time, we'll probably talk about, opening day was supposed to be this past Thursday, March 26th. I was supposed to go to Petco Park to watch Colorado Rockies against San Diego Padres, and hopefully what was supposed to be, like, at least like as a naive Padres fan, thinking that this might be our return to the playoffs, but that's going to have to be delayed for now. But I think Mark and I, we're both big baseball fans. He's a Giants fan, a Padres fan. We'll probably talk about our favorite opening day memories, just to kind of go back down memory lane, kind of like how we had like this whole virtual like opening day at home thing, just kind of going over what opening day means, and some good memories from the past that we unfortunately weren't able to live this year. We're probably going to talk about, other sports that we're going to go on now, like March Madness, the NBA. Obviously, we've already breached on a little bit, but we'll go a little bit deeper. And then we're kind of going to talk a lot about, like, NFL free agency over time. Like, obviously the big signing of Tom Brady to the Buccaneers and, other big signings and kind of the implications of free agency and including the NFL draft in these uncertain times. And we'll talk about, like, the labor deals that's happened in Major League Baseball and the National Football League. And we're probably going to go into, like, the Olympics, NCAA eligibility issues, pro sports that have been trying to start up in Korea, Japan, and China. So there's a lot to talk about, even though there's no sports going on. But hopefully – go ahead.
And with opening day, we'll be talking about both our favorite memories, but also then sort of looking ahead at, what does it look like the season's going to be? Major League Baseball and the Major League Players Association came to an agreement. And so we'll talk about some of the details of that, break down who is it good for, who is it bad for. There's been some changes to Major League Baseball draft, which that's kind of my area of expertise. That's where I've worked in. And there's some real consequences. Again, we're talking about this, but players are going to be losing opportunities, potentially losing salaries, but others are also gaining some security with that expense. So we'll be kind of doing that sport by sport. We'll start with baseball, probably talk about football next, talk about free agency, get into basketball, and then start talking, again, Olympics, all of it.
Yeah, we're still a little bit unsure how often we're going to do the show. We might do it twice a week. We might do more than that. We might only do weekly.
Depends how bored we are.
Yeah, it kind of depends how bored we are. Obviously this is a pretty fluid situation. So we're going to make an Instagram page and a Facebook page and maybe even Twitter page. We'll see. We'll be sharing it on our own social media. So be sure to give that a follow. We'll probably post this video somewhere. Make sure to like it, subscribe it. Yeah. Give us any feedback in the comments about what you've seen today. Any topics you might want us to talk about, we're more than welcome to, possibly look into those. We're not only sports limited too. We can talk about some other things. We might not be as knowledgeable about it, but like the sports talk might run out after a little while, so we might need to find some new avenues. Although honestly, like there's always something going on, so it's like there's probably some news stories that will pop up in the next week or two that we won't even have a chance to breach like anytime soon. So, but yeah, just keep we hope you enjoyed this. This was kind of impromptu because we thought we were just going to do a test run, and then all of a sudden this ended up becoming a full-blown episode because the talk was pretty good, honestly. So hopefully you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.
Yep. This was the Marc and Mike Show.
Signing off.